In this video, we'll be looking at ad hoc expenses. So that's any expense that doesn't relate either to mileage or to travel time. Before we can add ad hoc expenses to events, we must first set up appropriate expense types. In this example, I've set up 4 expense types. If we take a look at meal allowance, we'll see a field available for service users. This is where we specify that the expense type can be potentially chargeable, and available for care workers is this type of expense potentially payable. I've got a pay uplift expense type set up. In this case, we're talking about an additional amount that may be paid to care workers, perhaps as an incentive to work, and in that case those expenses are unlikely to be chargeable, so available for service users is not picked. Once we've set up our expense types, we can add expenses directly to events. We can do that from any calendar within Plait. I'm going to use the service user calendar. To add an ad hoc expense to an event, click Edit, Edit with tab screen. The charge element for an ad hoc expense is dealt with from the service users tab, the pay element from the care workers tab. Let's look at the charge first. And we'll see on the service users tab that below the name of the service user, we now have an expenses list, currently blank. To add an expense for this service user, click on Add, type in the name of the expense type and the amount that will be charged. You may have noticed that as I added that expense, the charge amount for Arthur has been broken down into the amount that will be charged for the event itself and the amount that is being charged for expenses. We'll look now at the pay amount, which is entered from the care workers tab. Below the name of the care worker, we have an expenses list. To add an expense for Tracy Abel, click Add, type in the name of the expense type and the amount that will be paid. Each care worker, and indeed each service user, can have as many expenses as are required. So to add an additional expense, click Add again, type in the name of the relevant expense type and the amount. Again, the amount that will be paid to Tracy Abel is broken down into the amount being paid for the event and the amount being paid for expenses. This particular event is part of a 2-carer run, and if we look above, we can see that Tracy Abel has already touched into this event, but Will Kane is yet to touch in. For run events that are part of a run, you cannot add expenses until the care worker is touched into that event. So before I can add expenses for Will Kane, either he needs to have touched into the event from the point of care, or we would need to use the option here to log the care worker arrival from the office. After adding expenses to an event, we would save those changes, and the next time invoicing is run, the charge for the expense will be invoiced. The next time payroll is run, the pay amount will be added to the pay advice. So we'll see examples of that if we look at an earlier event where invoicing has already been run. Click on the event, Edit, Edit with tab screen. On the service users tab, we can see that there is a reference to invoice number 1008. And this invoice has a number of events, some of which have expenses on them. Looking at the care workers tab for the same event, we'll see a reference to pay advice number 10004. And on that pay advice, again, there are a number of events, some of which have got one or more expenses on them. This particular example, there is actually 2 pay advice documents that include this event. The first one was credited. The reason for the credit could be because the amount that was paid was wrong, but it could also be because the expenses are wrong. So in the case where an expense is entered incorrectly, or perhaps an expense wasn't recorded at all when it should have been, we can credit the appropriate pay advice. We can then adjust those expenses as appropriate, and then we can run payroll for a second time. So because it is necessary potentially to do that, The expenses list shown below the care worker name and the service user name are never locked. So you can always go back and add additional expenses, delete expenses, or adjust the amounts for those expenses. Of course, if you do any of those three things, it's not going to affect existing invoices or existing pay advice, but that is the way that you would be able to make corrections as appropriate.